October 14th, 1965. The Zossen Command Bunker, deep in East Germany, was a concrete tomb buried under a pine forest. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and ozone from the humming electronic maps. This was the nerve center of Operation October Storm, the largest Warsaw-packed military exercise in a decade. Marshal of the Soviet Union Ivan Konyev, a man whose face was a roadmap of the Eastern Front, stared at the main strategic display. The map was a sea of red arrows, representing his tank armies, poised to demonstrate their unstoppable power in a simulated blitzkrieg across the Fulda Gap. For 3 days, everything had proceeded with the brutal, beautiful logic of Soviet military science. The numbers were on their side. The doctrine was proven. The plan was perfect. Then the impossible happened. It began not with a bang, but with a crackle of static over a command speaker. A frantic voice, the commander of the 11th Guards Tank Division, cut through the routine reports. He was screaming. His words were disjointed, nonsensical. He spoke of an enemy that was not there one moment and everywhere the next. He spoke of a phantom battalion, a unit that had materialized directly on top of his division's command post, deep behind the supposed front line. It had appeared out of nowhere, on a hilltop that was supposed to be secure. Artillery was already raining down. His command element was being systematically dismantled. The generals in the Zossen bunker exchanged uneasy glances. They assumed it was a failure of reconnaissance. A stay-behind unit they had missed. An airborne drop, perhaps, though no transport aircraft had been detected on their extensive radar networks. The marshal barked an order into his microphone, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. He demanded clarity. He demanded a situation report that made sense according to the laws of war as he understood them. The response that came back over the next 30 minutes shattered those laws completely. It was not a company. It was a full battalion, a combined arms force, with its own mortars, its own heavy machine guns, even its own anti-tank weapons. And then, the most unbelievable report of all, it had its own artillery. 3 full batteries of 105mm howitzers were now emplaced and firing from that hilltop. The division commander, his voice now laced with a kind of hysterical awe, swore that the guns had simply been dropped from the sky. The entire force, over 800 men and their heavy equipment, had deployed and become combat effective in under 20 minutes. A cold silence descended upon the bunker. The hum of the electronics seemed to grow louder, a mocking drone in the sudden vacuum of human speech. The operations officers frantically checked their logs. No, there were no enemy airfields close enough for a glider assault on that scale. No, the radar had picked up no fleet of heavy transports. No, there was no intelligence indicating the existence of a paratrooper force this large held in reserve by the Blue Force aggressors. A full battalion, with its artillery, moving from a road march to a fully fortified, combat-ready position would take hours, perhaps half a day. It involved convoys of trucks, engineers clearing paths, painstaking emplacement of the guns, the distribution of ammunition. It was a slow, loud, and brutally logistical process. What had been reported was not warfare. It was sorcery. On the map, a single blue icon began to blink malevolently, deep inside the solid red of the 11th Guards Tank Division. It was a cancer cell, a point of pure impossibility that defied every textbook, every training manual, every hard-won lesson from the Great Patriotic War. The marshal stared at that blinking light, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. He was a man who had commanded millions, who had hurled entire armies against the fascist hordes and watched cities burn. He understood war as a thing of mass, of steel, of mud, and of time. The blinking blue light on his map did not respect time. It did not respect logistics. It treated the battlefield not as a plane to be crossed, but as a chessboard where it could place its queen anywhere it pleased. In the cold, concrete heart of his power, Marshal Konyev felt a flicker of an emotion he had not experienced since 1941. He felt fear. The room was a tomb, and they were staring at a ghost. The initial reports from Operation October Storm landed on the desks of the Soviet General Staff in Moscow like unexploded bombs. At first, they were dismissed as exercise artifacts, exaggerations from a panicked field commander, or even clever enemy disinformation. But as intelligence analysts from the GRU cross-referenced the reports with other sources, signals intercepts, informant chatter from West Germany, grainy satellite photos of American bases, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The Phantom Battalion was not an anomaly. It was a system. This realization elevated the incident from a tactical puzzle to a full-blown strategic emergency. The entire edifice of Soviet military doctrine, a philosophy known as deep battle, was predicated on the overwhelming application of massed, echeloned forces. The plan to conquer Western Europe was simple in its horrifying calculus. Wave after wave of tank armies would smash through NATO lines, accepting massive casualties, but moving so fast and with such relentless pressure that the defenders would be shattered before they could properly mobilize or resort to nuclear weapons. It was a doctrine that treated warfare as a problem of physics, of mass and velocity. But this new American capability introduced a new, terrifying variable. It introduced teleportation. How do you fight an enemy who does not adhere to a front line? How do you attack an echelon when the enemy can simply leapfrog over your first, second, and even third waves to strike directly at your command posts, your supply depots, your artillery parks? The American system didn't just counter deep battle, it rendered it obsolete. It turned the Soviet Union's greatest strength, its sheer, ponderous size, into its greatest vulnerability. The vast armored columns would become nothing more than giant, slow-moving targets, easily tracked and constantly harassed by hornets' nests of infantry and artillery that could appear and disappear at will. The front had been erased. The very geography of the battlefield had been warped. The geopolitical implications were catastrophic. The conventional military superiority that guaranteed the security of the Warsaw Pact and gave the Kremlin its leverage over the West was now in question. The threat of a massive, unstoppable conventional assault was the cornerstone of Soviet foreign policy. It was the iron fist that kept Eastern Europe in line and Western Europe in a state of perpetual anxiety. If that fist could be parried, bled, and dismembered by an enemy that moved like a ghost, the balance of power on the continent would be fundamentally, perhaps irreversibly, altered. The Soviet Union had spent 20 years and a crippling portion of its national treasure building a war machine designed to fight World War II again, only better. The blinking blue light on the map in Zasen suggested the Americans were preparing to fight World War III. Among the officers of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, the psychological decay was immediate and profound. The official reports were sanitized, but rumors spread through the barracks and command posts like a virus. They spoke of Vozdushnaya Cavalry, the air cavalry. They whispered tales of American infantry who didn't march, but flew. Soldiers who descended from the sky not with parachutes, but in swarms of strange, dragonfly-like machines. A mythology began to grow around this new capability, a mythology born of fear and incomprehension. They gave it a name. The zone, a patch of sky from which death could materialize without warning. Pilots began reporting strange radar signatures that would coalesce into a solid mass and then vanish. Tank commanders became paranoid about their flanks, knowing that the dense German forests that were supposed to protect them could now birth an enemy force at any moment. The zone was not a place. It was a state of being. It was the terrifying realization that at any second, the battle could come to you, from above, without notice and without mercy. The psychological dominance the Red Army had enjoyed for 2 decades had evaporated in the time it took a Phantom Battalion to land on a hill. The directive from the General Staff was terse and absolute. It was a document stripped of all pleasantries, its language as cold and hard as the Siberian winter. It tasked the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff, the GRU, with a single, overriding priority: to understand the source of this new American witchcraft. The problem was assigned to Directorate S, the branch responsible for the analysis of foreign military technology. The brightest minds, engineers, tacticians, and spies, were mobilized. This was not a routine intelligence-gathering operation. It was a hunt. They were hunting for the phantom that haunted their war plans. The process began with the meticulous collection of every scrap of available data. Special teams were dispatched to the Zasen exercise grounds to conduct forensic analyses, as if it were a crime scene. They measured blast craters from the simulated artillery, trying to deduce the trajectory and nature of the shells. They interviewed every single soldier and officer who had witnessed the event, their debriefings running for hours, transcribed and cross-referenced in excruciating detail. The interview transcripts were a collection of contradictions and high emotion. One tank commander swore he saw hundreds of machines in the sky. A signals officer insisted his equipment had detected nothing but background noise until the moment the attack began. A political officer, ever vigilant, suggested it was a complex psychological warfare operation designed to sow panic. Simultaneously, the GRU's global network was activated. Agents in West Germany were ordered to prioritize observation of American military bases, specifically those housing new, experimental units. They were told to risk everything to obtain photographs, documents, or first-hand accounts. Reconnaissance aircraft and, when orbits allowed, Zenit spy satellites were retasked. Their cameras strained to capture images of American training exercises, hoping to catch the Phantom in the act. The sensor data that flowed back to Moscow only deepened the mystery. Radar tapes from the exercise were analyzed frame by frame. They showed nothing. A few fleeting, low-altitude returns, dismissed by the original operators as ground clutter or a flock of birds. There was no massive aerial armada, no fleet of heavy transports. The Phantom had left no electronic footprints. The debriefings with the survivors were even more maddening. The soldiers were terrified, their accounts bordering on the supernatural. They described a sound they had never heard before, not the roar of a jet engine, but a rhythmic, percussive chopping that seemed to come from all directions at once. They described machines that moved in ways that defied physics, flitting between trees, hovering motionless, and then vanishing over a ridge. They described American soldiers who appeared fresh and organized, not exhausted and scattered like paratroopers after a drop. These were not raiders. They were methodical, professional infantry, and they had brought their entire arsenal with them. When intelligence officers interrogated captured Blue Force soldiers, part of the exercise protocol, they got nothing. The Americans, mostly young conscripts, just shrugged and said, "The box does it." What was the box? A computer? A new type of vehicle? A code name? The phrase was maddeningly opaque. It was a wall of slang and assumed knowledge that the Soviet investigators could not penetrate. The collected evidence was a pile of irreconcilable facts. One set of data proved that a massive, rapid deployment had occurred. Another, equally valid set of data proved it was impossible. There were not enough heavy-lift aircraft in the entire NATO inventory to move a battalion and its artillery in a single lift. The logistical requirements for fuel and maintenance for such an operation would be staggering, requiring a forward airbase that simply did not exist. The phenomenon seemed to violate the fundamental principles of mass and energy. It was as if the Americans had found a way to ignore the brutal arithmetic of logistics that had governed warfare since the time of Caesar. The file on the vertical blitzkrieg grew thicker, filled with reports, photographs, and analyses, but it brought the investigators no closer to an answer. It only made the Phantom seem more powerful, more unknowable. The machine did not crash. It wrote itself into their nightmares. Inside the sterile analysis rooms of Directorate S, the Soviet military's finest minds began the process of trying to cage the Phantom. They were men trained in a rigid, materialistic worldview. Every effect must have a cause. Every weapon must have a blueprint. They could not accept the idea of a system or a doctrine being the weapon itself. Their entire intellectual framework demanded a physical object, a piece of tangible hardware they could identify, study, and ultimately, copy. This was the hunt for the magic bullet, a singular technological breakthrough that would explain everything. This fundamental misunderstanding would lead them down a series of intellectual dead ends, each one more elaborate and more wrong than the last. Their investigation became a monument to flawed assumptions. The first and most persistent theory centered on the existence of a secret American superhelicopter. Soviet helicopter design philosophy, embodied by the immense Mi-6 and the forthcoming Mi-26, prioritized raw lifting power. Their engineers were in a constant struggle to build bigger engines and stronger rotor systems to lift heavier loads. It was natural, therefore, for them to project their own design philosophy onto their adversary. They theorized that the Americans must have secretly developed a colossal heavy-lift aircraft, a flying crane capable of carrying multiple armored vehicles, or a company of infantry in a single sortie. GRU agents were tasked with finding evidence of this mythical beast. They spent months observing American air bases, looking for hangars of impossible size or strange shapes under tarpaulins. They found nothing. The theory persisted anyway, fueled by a refusal to believe that a swarm of smaller, conventional helicopters could be coordinated so effectively. A second theory emerged from the chemistry and propulsion labs. Perhaps the magic bullet was not the aircraft, but its fuel. The analysts calculated the fuel consumption required for the hundreds of helicopter sorties needed to move a battalion and concluded it was logistically unsustainable in a fluid battle. Therefore, the Americans must have developed a revolutionary new propellant. A gelled fuel, perhaps, or even a form of liquid nuclear isomer that offered 10 times the energy density of standard kerosene. This would grant the helicopters almost unlimited range and loiter time, eliminating the need for vulnerable forward arming and refueling points. It was a theory born of science fiction, but it was more comforting than the chaotic truth. It suggested a problem that could be solved in a laboratory, a chemical formula that could be stolen or replicated. A third, more exotic theory gained traction among the more imaginative analysts. They looked at the radar data, or lack thereof, and posited the existence of a new type of vehicle altogether. Not a helicopter, but a massive ground effect vehicle, or ekranoplan. The Soviet Union was a world leader in this technology, and they imagined the Americans had built a stealthy, high-speed version that could skim below radar over the flat plains of Germany, landing on rivers or fields to disgorge troops before vanishing again. This explained the lack of radar detection and the speed of the deployment. It was a theory that flattered their own technological prowess, assuming the enemy was simply a step ahead on a path they were already on. It was also completely wrong. Other theories were debated with equal seriousness. The most cynical theory was that of massive deception. The Americans, they argued, were cheating. The entire event was an elaborate piece of theater. The battalion and its artillery were not flown in at all, but had been prepositioned in secret underground caches, a violation of all treaties and exercise rules. The helicopters were just a distraction. This theory was popular among the high command because it preserved their worldview and painted the enemy as dishonorable, but it didn't explain the growing body of evidence from other intelligence sources showing similar exercises taking place in the United States. A fifth theory attempted to downplay the threat. The deployed force, it argued, was not a true combined arms battalion. It was a specialized, lightly armed raiding force. Air commandos, armed only with rifles and radios, designed for harassment, not for sustained combat. This was a comforting thought. It reduced the Phantom to a manageable nuisance. But it was contradicted by the verified reports of heavy mortars, anti-tank guided missiles, and especially the devastatingly effective artillery that had appeared on the hilltop. The evidence pointed not to a raid, but to a genuine battle formation. A sixth theory even postulated a direct mind-machine interface, allowing a single pilot to control a swarm of drone-like helicopters, which explained the incredible coordination. Based on these flawed conclusions, the Soviet military began to develop equally flawed countermeasures. Resources were poured into the development of new, rapid-tracking ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft systems, designed to engage swarms of low-flying targets. The design bureaus were ordered to accelerate development of their own heavy-lift helicopters, chasing the mythical American superlifter. The focus was entirely on hardware solutions to a problem that was not about hardware. They were building a better sword, oblivious to the fact that the enemy had invented the firearm. Every ruble spent on these futile countermeasures was a ruble not spent on understanding the real revolution. The phantom in their minds, the hunt for the magic bullet, was blinding them, leading them to reinforce their own doctrinal prison. They were profoundly, dangerously, and completely wrong. While the General Staff in Moscow was chasing phantoms, the answer was being born years earlier, not in a top-secret laboratory, but on the dusty parade grounds of Fort Benning, Georgia. The truth was not a secret weapon. It was a radical, almost heretical idea. It was the result of a clash of cultures within the United States Army itself, a battle between old guard traditionalists who saw the future of war in bigger tanks and heavier artillery, and a small group of iconoclasts who saw it in the sky. The origin of the Phantom Battalion lay in the frustrations of the Korean War. On the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Korean peninsula, the American Army's immense logistical tail and road-bound armored divisions had often been rendered useless. Infantry units were forced into brutal, leg-slogging marches up and down hills, while their supply lines were easily ambushed. A group of officers, led by visionaries like General James M. Gavin and General Hamilton H. Howze, began to ask a simple question. What if we could free the infantrymen from the tyranny of terrain? What if we could give the ground army the same three-dimensional mobility as the Air Force? This led to the creation of the Tactical Mobility Requirements Board in 1962, known universally as the Howze Board. They were given a mandate to explore the outer limits of what was possible with a new generation of turbine-powered helicopters. Their conclusion was revolutionary. They did not recommend building a few specialized helicopter units. They recommended creating an entire division where the helicopter would replace the truck, the jeep, and in many ways, the tank. They envisioned a new form of combined arms warfare where infantry, artillery, reconnaissance, and logistics were all airborne. It was a concept so radical that many in the Pentagon dismissed it as science fiction. But the idea took root. The core innovation was not a piece of technology, but a system of systems. It was a philosophy. The first component was the technology itself, but not in the way the Soviets imagined. The star of the show was not a superlifter, but the humble Bell UH-1 Iroquois. The Huey was not the fastest, biggest, or most powerful helicopter. It was the opposite. It was a simple, rugged, reliable machine designed for mass production. It was the Model T of the sky, a good enough airframe that could be produced by the tens of thousands. Its genius was not in its performance, but in its ubiquity. The Americans weren't planning to build a handful of flying cranes. They were planning to build a cloud of flying pickup trucks. The second component was the integration of this technology into a coherent fighting organism, the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. This new division was built from the ground up around the helicopter. Its infantry squads were trained to embark and disembark from a hovering Huey in seconds. Its artillery was a new, lightweight 105mm howitzer that could be slung underneath a CH-47 Chinook and be ready to fire within 15 minutes of landing. Its cavalry was not horses or tanks, but rocket-firing AH-1 Cobra gunships that could scout ahead and provide devastatingly accurate fire support. Its logistics were airborne, with Chinooks carrying giant rubber bladders of fuel, nicknamed Fat Cows, to create instant refueling points anywhere on the battlefield. It was a self-contained, air-breathing ecosystem of war. The third, and most crucial, component was the philosophical one, decentralized command. The airmobile concept could only work if junior officers, squad leaders, platoon commanders, individual pilots, were empowered to make rapid decisions without waiting for orders from above. The system was built on a network of reliable FM radios and a culture of trust and initiative. A company commander, pinned down by enemy fire, could use his radio to summon artillery, gunships, and medical evacuation on his own authority. This created a command and control loop that was incredibly fast and adaptable. The real computational advantage was not an electronic box. It was the distributed processing power of hundreds of trained, empowered human minds, all working in concert. The system reacted not at the speed of a general moving pins on a map, but at the speed of a lieutenant speaking into a handset. This system directly created the impossible event that so terrified the Soviets. The Phantom Battalion did not materialize out of thin air in a single lift. It was moved by a continuous, high-speed air bridge. While the first company of infantry was landing and establishing a perimeter, the second was already in the air, and the third was loading onto helicopters at a rear base. The artillery was flown in next, followed by ammunition and supplies. To an observer on the ground, it looked like a magical, instantaneous appearance of a full combat force. In reality, it was a finely tuned logistical ballet, performed at a tempo the Soviets could not even comprehend. They were looking for a single cause, a magic bullet. The reality was 1,000 small, coordinated actions happening in perfect sync. The answer was not a machine. It was a new way of thinking about war. The jungles of Southeast Asia became the laboratory where the Soviet Union's theoretical fears were confirmed with brutal, empirical data. The Vietnam War was the Airmobile Division's trial by fire. For the first time, GRU analysts and technical advisors embedded with the North Vietnamese Army could see the Phantom in action. They no longer had to rely on grainy photos or panicked exercise reports. They could now study its tactics, its capabilities, and most importantly, its wreckage. When the first downed UH-1 Huey was dragged from a rice paddy and transported north, it was treated with the reverence of a captured alien spacecraft. Soviet engineers were flown in to dissect it, screw by screw. The moment of confrontation with the truth came not in a flash of insight, but in the quiet, methodical process of a technical teardown. In a secure facility outside Moscow, a team of the Soviet Union's best aviation engineers stood around the battered, mud-caked fuselage of the American helicopter. They had expected to find secrets, revolutionary technologies that would justify the myths. What they found was a profound, soul-crushing anticlimax. The report they filed with the General Staff was a document of pure humiliation. The first layer of shock was technological. The Huey was simple. Its Lycoming T-53 turbine engine was efficient and powerful, but it was not based on any physics unknown to Soviet science. Their own Klimov and Isotov design bureaus could, in theory, build such an engine. The airframe was a straightforward semi-monocoque design, using aluminum alloys they were familiar with. The avionics were functional, a collection of radios and basic navigation aids, but lacked the Baroque complexity they had anticipated. There was no secret fuel cell, no exotic material, no revolutionary guidance computer. The magic bullet they had been hunting for over half a decade did not exist. The weapon was mundane. The second layer of shock was industrial, and it cut much deeper. While the individual components of the Huey held no great secrets, the way they were manufactured was a revelation. The tolerances were incredibly precise. The turbine blades, the gearboxes, the rotor hub, all were built with a level of mass production quality control that the Soviet industrial base, geared for crude, brute force output, simply could not replicate. And then there was the sheer number of them. Intelligence estimates, confirmed by the serial numbers on the captured airframe, indicated that the Americans were building these machines not by the dozen or the hundred, but by the thousand. The Huey was not a priceless chariot. It was a disposable tool. The Soviet system, which treated every tank and aircraft as a major state asset, could not comprehend this philosophy. They couldn't build a perfect copy because their entire economic and industrial system was fundamentally unsuited to the task. They could build a single, handcrafted prototype, but they could not build an entire air force of them. The third layer of shock was philosophical. It was the dawning, horrifying realization that they had been asking the wrong question all along. The Americans hadn't built a better helicopter. They had built a new way to fight a war. The Huey was not the weapon. It was just a single component, like a nerve cell in a vast, intelligent organism. The true weapon was the division, the system, the doctrine of decentralized, networked warfare. The Soviets had been trying to build a bigger, stronger fist, while the Americans had rewired the nervous system. The problem wasn't in their factories, it was in their heads. Their entire military philosophy, with its rigid, top-down command structure and its focus on ponderous, sequential operations, was a relic. They had prepared for a two-dimensional war of attrition on the plains of Europe, and the Americans were preparing to fight a three-dimensional war of maneuver in the minds of their commanders. A desperate order came down from the Kremlin itself. Copy it. The military was instructed to create its own air assault brigades. On paper, they looked impressive. Motor rifle divisions were redesignated. Me-8 and Me-24 helicopters were assigned. But it was a hollow, tragic farce. They lacked the sheer numbers of transport helicopters to make the concept viable. Their helicopters were heavier and less agile. They had no equivalent of the lightweight, sling-loadable artillery. But the most critical failure was cultural. A Soviet field commander would never be granted the autonomy and air support authority of his American counterpart. To do so would violate the central tenets of Soviet command and control. The attempt to replicate air mobility was a failure because they copied the hardware without understanding the software. It was a Potemkin Air Force, a coat of paint on a crumbling doctrinal wall, a testament to a system that could imitate form but could never grasp substance. The final scorecard was written in the blood and fire of the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. In the first major battle between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam, a single, outnumbered American airmobile battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was inserted deep into enemy territory. For 4 days, surrounded and relentlessly attacked by a force 3 times its size, the battalion held its ground. The difference was air mobility. Continuous waves of Huey helicopters ferried in reinforcements and ammunition and evacuated the wounded, while artillery, flown into the landing zone, provided constant fire support. Cobra gunships acted as a steel curtain, breaking up enemy assaults with rockets and miniguns. The final statistics were brutal and lopsided. The American battalion suffered significant losses, but it inflicted casualties on the North Vietnamese regulars that were 10 times higher. It was a tactical victory born of a strategic revolution. A small, networked force had defeated a much larger, conventionally deployed enemy. The Phantom had shown its face, and it was devastating. The encounter with American air mobility was more than a military challenge. It was a symptom of a deeper, systemic rot within the Soviet system. It forced Moscow into a new, ruinously expensive arms race. Vast sums were poured into developing a whole new generation of mobile surface-to-air missile systems and self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, like the SA-9 Gaskin and the ZSU-23-4 Shilka. These complex systems were designed with one primary purpose: to counter the swarms of low-flying helicopters they now saw in their nightmares. This diversion of resources from an already straining command economy further hastened its eventual collapse. The West's advantage was not merely technological, it was economic and philosophical. It was the advantage of a system that fostered flexibility, innovation, and decentralized problem-solving over one that demanded rigid adherence to a central plan. The core lesson was a damning indictment of the entire Soviet project. The failure was not in the courage of its soldiers or the genius of its weapon designers. It was a failure of imagination. The Marxist-Leninist ideology that underpinned the state also shackled its military thinking. It preached a scientific approach to warfare that was deterministic and centrally controlled, believing that battle could be calculated and managed like an industrial 5-year plan. The American concept of air mobility was the antithesis of this. It was chaotic, fluid, and improvisational. It embraced the uncertainty of the battlefield and empowered junior leaders to exploit it. It was a philosophical challenge that the rigid, hierarchical Soviet system was incapable of meeting. They could not build a system that trusted the individual more than the plan. It was an intellectual leap they were not structured to make. The legacy of that conceptual breakthrough at Fort Benning is still visible on every modern battlefield. The helicopter was permanently transformed from a niche utility aircraft into a centerpiece of land warfare. The doctrines of air assault and vertical envelopment are now fundamental pillars of military planning for every major power in the world. The descendants of the Huey and the Cobra, the Black Hawk and the Apache, are the direct inheritors of this revolution, flying arsenals that combine mobility and firepower in ways the generals in the Zasen bunker could never have imagined. The Soviets eventually developed their own formidable helicopter forces, particularly the iconic Mi-24 Hind gunship, but they were always reacting, always one step behind, trying to catch up to a paradigm shift that had already happened. The Soviet Union was not defeated by a single weapon. It was defeated by an idea. It was a system that could produce 20,000 T-72 tanks, but could not tolerate the intellectual freedom required to invent a new way of fighting. The men in the Kremlin had spent a generation preparing for a grand, Wagnerian clash of steel on the North European plain, a war of attrition and mass. They were met instead by a war of information and maneuver, a conflict where the most decisive weapon was not a heavier tank, but a faster thought. The microchip, embodied not in a computer but in a networked system of minds and machines, had triumphed over the smokestack. The Cold War was lost not in the 1980s, but in that quiet, concrete bunker in 1965, in the moment a single blue light began to blink on a map, a ghost from a future they could not comprehend and were powerless to create.